This episode is sponsored by JMR Rentals, professional digital cinema and broadcast rentals in Brooklyn, New York. To find out more, visit their website, jmrny.com. Hello and welcome to No Rest for the Weekend, where we go behind the scenes and talk to the creators of independent entertainment. I'm Jason Godbey, and joining me via Zoom today, he is the director of the new documentary, Suzi Q, Mr. Liam Firmager. Welcome, Liam.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
All the way, you're coming to us from down under?
Melbourne, Australia.
And is that's where you're from originally, obviously?
Yeah, I was born here, so yeah.
So I want to talk to you about Suzi Q. I saw it, gave it a great review. I like the movie a lot. But first, I want to talk to you about you. You're definitely the furthest away interview that we've ever had on the show. I'm not always a big fan of Zoom video quality, but it's great that I can do this, and talk to people like you. So just to kind of give us a quick background, how did you get into filmmaking, and what is your origin story?
I got into filmmaking. I'm actually an ex-musician. I think whether or not you can be ex-musician, but I used to sort of play in bands and do the whole releasing CD sort of thing. And there was this demand for us to do videos for the band, and it was so prohibitively expensive to sort of engage somebody else to do it that I sort of put my hand up and went, "Hey, I'll learn how to do it." And so it kind of started from there, making music videos for our band. And other bands would see what we'd done and say, "Hey, can you do one for us?" And so I do videos for other bands. And suddenly I was making music videos for people. And then I thought, hang on, I can extend this format and I can actually tell stories. So it would have been, I don't know, 15 years ago where I put my first sort of short out. And I just really sort of had a second wind in life, if you like. I sort of almost reinvented myself and what I wanted to do creatively. And I still get to incorporate music, obviously, in what I do, which is real joy. So bringing those two loves together. But I grew up sort of in England, went to school there, and I spent a lot of time working in Ireland, and sort of spent some time in living in the west coast of Ireland as well. So I did have that opportunity to simulate sort of those different sort of spaces and cultures as well, which it does give you a stronger sort of more objective insight into sort of the way people think and behave, and that was a real strength that I think I brought to my filmmaking. I didn't have that sort of parochial kind of viewpoint in approaching the subjects that I deal with and the stories that I tell.
Very cool. Just to give us, in terms of the number of films you've done, is this your first feature documentary? Have you done other documentaries before?
I actually did another documentary that was shelved, unfortunately. I won't go into the reasons for that, very complicated. But there certainly was a big education doing that first doc. I mean, it was a real a joy to do. I'd done lots of short films, and I'd done a feature mockumentary that was released in Australia about a one-hit wonder from the 80s that was making a comeback. So sort of I dabbled in all sorts of areas in film, whether it was comedy or drama. But really documentary seems to be a strong forte of mine, that I think I bring personal sort of strengths to the genre that just seem to work.
Your sort of subgenre of documentary is my favorite. I'm a big rock doc kind of fan, and this is an interesting film because I was saying to you before we rolled, I didn't know much about Suzi Quatro, and I knew much of her lineage. I had seen probably it's like somebody who doesn't think they like the blues, but if they listen to rock and roll, they've heard that their whole life. So because she was such an innovator, but like, how did this whole thing come about? Did you know her? Did you like how did you know of her, and how did you what was kind of the inspiration behind it?
Well, I think the inspiration was I as being a musician, I always wanted to sink my teeth into a music doc, and but I wanted it to be something interesting, something sort of a little unusual. And through a mutual friend who knew Suzi, she'd sort of said to me, you know, no one's ever made a documentary on Suzi Quatro. And that kind of blew me away. I thought, what? I mean, she was massively popular in Australia and England and Europe. And sure enough, no one had. So I reached out to her through this friend and I said, look, I think I'm the guy to do it. And Susie laughed and says, why do you think you're the guy to do it? And I said, well, you know, I'm not a fan. And she was like, oh, what? And I said, let me clarify. I mean, I really admire you, but I never grew up with your music, so I was never a fan. Um, so I think that I would bring a certain objectivity to it, and a certain, you know, because I love rock music and that's my background, that I understand and sympathize with your journey and your story. And she loved that. So she said, yep, I think you're the guy to do it. So we took it from there.
One thing that's really cool, and do me a favor and don't be shy, drop a few names. Talk about like you had some amazing access for this. Like you got some great people. Give me a list, and just kind of like how did you get to, like how did you talk to some of these folks?
Well, initially I knew exactly what I wanted for the documentary, you know, because I knew that Susie had been a marginalized, forgotten person in sort of the story of rock and roll, that I needed to bring the heavyweights in testify to her influence and greatness. So I had a hit list, and I reached out to people like Alice Cooper and Debbie Harry, Henry Winkler from Happy Days, Gary Marshall, the producer, the guys from Talking Heads, Lita Ford, Cherie Curry, Joan Jett, you know, people who knew her and, you know, were certainly influenced heavily by her. I dragged in people from England like Sir Tim Rice, the composer, you know, Andy Scott from Sweet, Don Powell from Slade. Uh, so the process was a lot easier than I thought it would be. I thought I would spend a year just like, you know, dead end email trails. Um, but thankfully and fortunately, Susie had some of those contacts to begin with. You know, 50 years in the industry, you're going to have a pretty thick black book. So she opened that book up to me and said, look, I do have this person's email. It's 10 years old. You may get them, you may not. So that kind of started my little sort of search and reaching out. But the surprising thing was how many of them just quickly put their hand up and said, yep, I'll do it. When do you want me? Which blew me away. And they cleared their calendars. They made room. Because all of them, to a person, recognized that, you know, Susie had such a big influence and was so important in the story of women in rock, but her story had been marginalized and forgotten. You know, people in the States, certainly, you know, the majority of them have no idea who Suzi Quatro is. And if they do, they think Suzi Quatro, oh yeah, Leather Tuscadero and Happy Days. And that was such a minor part of her overall story and her journey. So it was really fantastic to have those celebs and rock stars put their hand up and just say, you know, if you fly over to LA, I'll do it. And so a lot of the process of putting the film together, it took a few years, but a lot of that was simply just traveling and scheduling to sort of grab these people. We had fantastic names like Tom Hanks and Ron Howard put their hand up and say, we'll do it. When do you want us? But unfortunately, conflicts and schedules got in the way eventually because, you know, those guys are in high demand. But it was just really fantastic to have them put their hand up and say, yeah, look, we'd love to be a part of it, which is really indicative of, you know, how important Suzi Quatro was.
So you started out in terms of the process. Was she the first interview? Was it like, let's get all this stuff with her, and then because it could have just been a profile. You could have just talked to her, and you got some great footage. You have some great archival footage, that's a whole thing. That's like making a whole other movie right there, right?
Right.
So, what was the process? Was it like, did you talk to her and then talk to these other people? Was it back and forth? Like, how do you like write that sort of, give it a structure kind of thing?
Yeah, I didn't really have a clear structure in mind when I started. I really wanted it to be, I wanted it to evolve. I wanted to understand her. I wanted to understand how people felt about her. I didn't want to impose my own restrictions or vision on this. You know, it had to be her story. Um, so really, it was a back and so to and fro process. I'd interview her, you know, in England at one stage, or I'd interview her when she was on tour in Melbourne, or I interviewed her at her birthday party in Detroit. So I did a lot of flying around, following her around on tour and sort of these family reunions, etc. Um, and it really, I don't think the story really presented itself until about halfway through, um, when there was one particular point in time I sat down with her at her home in England, and we had the film crew there, and we had the lights set up, and you know the sound guy there with the boom. And I felt we weren't really getting anywhere because Suzi was giving sort of stock answers, because she'd been doing this for 50 years and, you know, in the industry. And so she'd just, you know, bring out the chestnuts, the old answers. And so Tate, who's the producer, sort of suggested, well, why don't you just send everyone home and you just sit down with her? You operate the camera, you do the sound, you put the lights up, and I did that. And on that particular day, it became more of an intimate conversation between two friends, if you like. And that's when she actually opened up, and sort of the mask dropped, and I got to see the real Suzi Quatro, not the icon or the rock star. Um, and at that moment, I realized we have a film.
One of the things I noticed is that, you know, you're getting very, like, you talk to her family. She talks
Mm,
about her family. She talks about leaving her family, you know, and this is probably stuff she didn't really talk about all that much. And you do get these
no.
very kind of like relaxed sort of human interviews. They don't feel like talking heads. I think that's the
Mm,
hardest thing. I mean,
mm.
I remember James Toback talked about, he interviewed Mike Tyson for his documentary Tyson, and he said, I asked him one question, he talked for 45 minutes, you know, because Mike Tyson has no filter, you know.
Yeah,
But most people are not Mike Tyson. But she
yeah.
seems very real. She seems very genuine, you know.
Oh yeah,
And
very much. She wears her heart on her sleeve, but there's a certain defensiveness there, and I think that's natural after sort of being in the industry for that period of time. And you know, you get journalists asking the same questions to her over and over again, and um, so there was that process in the early stages where I felt like I was stripping layers off, trying to get to the real person. And to her credit, she allowed me to do that, even though I guess she wasn't used to doing that. And so there was a certain amount of trust being built through that process, certainly in that first year anyways of being in her life. um, but you know, documentaries are a very weird beast, because I'm sure most documentary makers would tell you that in some respects they're a lot harder than doing a feature film, a dramatic feature film, with narrative, because it's a very isolating process when you make documentaries. um, you sit in a room by yourself for 15 hours a day. Um, you know, it's not a very collaborative experience apart from those early stages of filming interviews. It's a very isolating process to go through and sort of build this story, and most of it is self-editing to begin with anyway, certainly the rough cuts. Um, and so yeah, it's and certainly in terms of financially speaking as well, documentaries, they're a lot harder to entice investment, of course, you know, because it's such a risky proposition. And when you're dealing with a rock documentary, the licensing costs alone, you know, they give you an aneurysm. They're frightening, you know. And if you don't know the right people, and you don't know the right hoops to navigate to lessen those costs, you could find yourself spending 2 years and shelving a project because you can't afford to pay for the licensing, the songs, the images, the footage. So that in itself was a massive education to do that and not make the mistakes.
yeah, I think a lot of people, when they go into this, and especially with music, they don't realize how expensive it is. In terms of process for this, like, so you started talking to her, and then like how long were you actually filming? Because, you know, I like, there's like docu years, it's like dog years.
Yeah, the initial process, I think, of filming and sort of, you know, flying around and you know, getting those fantastic interviews, going through her archives, which her personal archives are extensive and fantastic. You know, that took about 18 months, you know. Then there was the period of, sort of chasing licensing down and, getting things signed off on, getting things paid for. Um, that takes another 12 months at least. Sort of ticking all those licensing and permission boxes is probably the most lengthy process of it all. Because we had to get permission and pay for every single image, piece of footage, piece of music. And we're talking, I think there's 600 still images alone in this documentary, as well as a whole catalog of songs, which, is spread in a wide range of uh, publishers and things like that. So, and I just really wanted to ensure that all her hits were represented and we had access to all those key clips like Happy Days and Annie Get Your Gun. And so, I'm not even going to tell you the budget for that licensing, but, that's a doco in itself. I could probably write a help book for documentarians on what to expect and what you're going to pay.
I think people need that book. Like
I think so. I mean, if I had that book to begin with, I'd be a lot.
How to Make a
have
Rock
a lot less
Doc
gray
would be a
hairs.
great. How to Make a Rock Doc would be a good would be a good resource. Just because I think I remember there was a great rock doc called "It Might Get Loud" by Davis Guggenheim, and they were talking about just like having to search through all these archives and find all of this footage. And they were going through YouTube and reaching out to people, and it's like this extensive process. It's like and then at the end of it, you can find all the footage, and then it's like, okay, well, how much is this going to cost, and when is it available? And and it's mind blowing. And then you also have the task of actually editing the movie once you get all that stuff. And you can do a lot with fair use. Like you can use fair use a lot, but fair use, is I think an American thing. I'm not sure how
it is an American thing. Yeah, absolutely. It's
so
completely
like I don't
different.
know if it holds up in Austin. Is there a fair use in?
It's far more restrictive here. There are
Okay.
certain instances of fair use, but for most part, someone's got their hand out.
Right. Okay. So yeah, because here, because I've done things like movie reviews and stuff, or you do like a video essay or something for YouTube.
Yeah.
And usually you can get if as long as you change the footage enough, as long as you're not just showing a scene. If you're talking over it, if you're making commentary, you change the visual, you can usually get away with fair use. But for the stuff you would take a scene from Happy Days and just plunk it in the middle of your movie. Yeah. You got to pay whoever owns Warner Brothers or whoever owns Happy Days.
Well, the curious thing about the Happy Days footage was, we when we were initially chasing up permissions and licensing for it, we simply could not find the person to green light it, to tick that box, because no one knew who was in charge of it. We'd gone through CBS and we'd gone through, I think, Universal, who took over at some stage, and then somebody took over them. And not only could they not find who actually could give the permission, they couldn't find the footage because no one knew where it was. So there's this whole process of, backwards and forwards and actually chasing people up and kicking some butts and saying, we really need this high quality footage. They came through eventually, and look, they were fantastic, surprisingly, because we were told some horror stories about, they're not going to be very helpful, but to their credit, actually, they came through and gave us a great rate. So
it's crazy because meanwhile, like you're going through all this red tape trying to get the footage. Meanwhile, you've got Henry Winkler on camera. You got Gary Marshall, who like exec produced the show,
right,
like on camera talking about it.
Yeah.
And it's like two worlds. And people say, oh yeah, it should be fine. And then when you actually have to, it's like trying to trace your lineage back to a country or something. And
Right.
talk, you might as well be talking to consulates of a country or something, trying to get immigration papers.
Yeah. Well, it was handy to name drop Henry Winkler, to the licensees, because it certainly does have traction, but it certainly doesn't have this sort of like roll out the red carpet, welcome, yes, whatever you want kind of thing either. The process is still, difficult to navigate, but yeah, certainly having him involved in the film made it easier.
Like I said, I enjoyed it immensely. What's next for it now? It's being distributed in Australia and also here in the States?
Well, we had our theatrical run in Australia, thankfully, before the COVID-19 hit. So, we had the traditional release in Australia, which was fantastic, and the same went for England, and the same went for, I think, Germany. It's still running at the moment in cinemas in Germany. But we had to delay our US release because of, the pandemic. And so our distributor decided to reshape the model, and not go for that traditional theatrical run, and instead go straight for the VOD. I think it gets released in the States on the 3rd of July, by memory. Yeah, really pumped about that, because it's really important for us to tell her story to the American audience, because they're kind of the ones who missed out on the wonderful Suzi Quatro journey. So
I'm a big fan of rock docs, and I thought yours was exceptionally well done. I loved, it's really hard because, and I've said this before on my show where, like you have and in fact, I interviewed a documentarian recently who had made a film called The Right Girls about like refugee women from South America coming through Mexico. And he had gone down, these were transsexual women and they were having a really hard time. And I was like, you see stuff like that. And it's like, well, how do you make it entertaining? How do you make it palatable? Because, your first objective as a filmmaker is you have to entertain while you're informing. And I think, you have to luck out with the subject. Suzi Quatro is an entertaining person.
Yeah.
she's interesting to listen to. And, even her family is interesting, and they're frank as hell. They're like, when you start talking to these, you're like, oh, I can't believe that person said that on camera, and then of course, when you get, somebody like Debbie Harry or Alice Cooper or somebody like that, of course, people are going to listen to that. That's the big fish names that you're going to talk to. But I also like the visual style that you used a lot. I thought you got a lot of great, not just a lot of great footage, but the visual style, the transitions and everything just help move it, because the movie moves,
Yeah, I really wanted to reflect the aesthetic of what we were doing, with 70s glam music, sort of embrace that whole exciting aesthetic of the glam movement and sort of infuse it into that style. But you raised an actual interesting point. I just wanted to touch upon that with the family and the sisters. And a lot of people walk away from the film saying, wow, those sisters were quite brutal, weren't they? And I have to tell them, they're actually lovely people. They're really lovely girls, Susie's sisters. You just have to understand that in context, it's an Italian family, and they're very vocal and they're very honest. They do love each other. They're very fond of each other. There is that strange reluctance to give her that kind of validation that she desperately wants. But as people, they're absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed my time with them, and following them around, and sitting down and talking with them. So it's an interesting dynamic.
I thought, there's a couple of times when my mouth dropped open. I think when I was watching, I thought, wow, he had somebody to say that on camera, and it seems like they did so voluntarily. Like it just came out, which is the best stuff you can get. But anyway, congratulations on the film. I'm going to wrap up, but if people want to know more about you, about the movie, where can they find you on the web?
Utopia Distribution, they're the ones putting it out, and I believe they're the ones handling the VOD stuff.
Thanks so much, Liam. The film is Suzi Q, and we'll look forward to seeing it. I wrote a great review about it. You could read it's on the website, and we'll look for more from you as well. When you have another project, definitely keep me posted. We'll have you back on the show.
Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate it.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for taking this trip down the rabbit hole. For more of our content, including our movie reviews, visit our website, norestoftheweekendpodcast.com. Don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. I'd like to thank JMR Rentals for sponsoring this episode. For more on them, visit their website, jmrny.com. And once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Liam Firmager. For Behind the Rabbit Productions, I'm Jason Godbey. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.